Hello and welcome to Face to Face. Today we're going to be talking about the issue of mining. I was surprised to hear on television a couple of days ago that the Canadian mining companies seem to be doing more damage everywhere in the world than the mining companies of any other country. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're talking with Graham Russell of the group Rights Action. And Graham, maybe you can tell us something about yourself and Rights Action.
Well, thanks for having me in. I'm from Toronto, did an undergrad in Latin American Studies at the University of Guelph, got a law degree at Ottawa University. Never practiced as a lawyer. Pretty much from the late 80s on, I've worked in a variety of different capacities, but in Central American solidarity activism, as a human rights lawyer, as a human rights activist, mainly focused on Central America. What I've been doing with Rights Action for the last 16 years is two main things. One is we are a direct funder of grassroots struggles in these countries, environmental defense struggles, human rights organizations, community development projects. And then the second thing we do is we focus a lot of attention on how Canada or the United States are often part of the problem in Central America. We often benefit from exploitation and poverty. The United States often militarily supports regimes in the region that carry out repression against their own populations. The issue of Canadian mining companies now is a perfect example of how Canada is part of the problem in Central America. So when we do our education and activism work, we say we ought to focus attention on how we in the global north are sometimes part of the problem, and we should be demanding change here at home. And so mining, the issue of a number of Canadian mining companies in Central America is a perfect example of that.
Now, from what I read, I was sent some information by Graham. From what I've read, I mean, communities are being blown up, people are being killed, beatings, rapes, and behind this are Canadian, and to very nice people. These things are happening to very nice people. And behind it are Canadian mining companies. Is that too strong?
No, it's not too strong. I am not here to say that every single mining company in the world operates this way in every single mining situation around the world. But we are dealing with some very devastating stories, particularly Goldcorp Inc. is a huge Canadian gold company that is operating open-pit cyanide leaching mines in Guatemala and Honduras. And there's a wide range of very serious health and environmental harms in both places. And in the case of Guatemala, there's been a long list of very serious cases of repression. People have been killed, people have been shot, and these are indigenous people in Guatemala that have suffered repression because they're opposing the harms and violations. We are dealing with a series of Canadian nickel mining companies, the latest of which is Hudbay Minerals. And in the eastern part of Guatemala, they've been, over the course of a few decades, been trying to forcibly evict Mayan Kekchi people in that region of the country so that they can get at the nickel ore. That situation is extremely violent. In the last 3 or 4 years, there's been widespread, in at least half a dozen communities, whole-scale burnings of the villages to the ground. These are very poor people living in thatched roof huts with bamboo walls and at a subsistence level. And the army, the police, and private security guards hired by the Canadian company have come in there and burnt the community to the ground. In one village, there was a case of the gang rape of 11 Indigenous women as part of a forced eviction. And again, this is related to Hudbay Minerals nickel mining company in eastern Guatemala. 2 years later, in 2009, a well-known community leader was targeted by the private security company, grabbed in front of eyewitnesses, machete hacked, and then shot to death. In the case of El Salvador, we don't work as much in El Salvador as we do in Guatemala and Honduras, but there's a very serious case of a Canadian company, Pacific Rim, that was trying to open a gold mine in El Salvador near the Honduran border. While there was a successful movement to oppose the opening of this illegal mine, I agree with the Salvadoran people that they did not have the permission to do it. They successfully kept the company out, but 5 community members have been assassinated. 4 were killed in 2009. 1 more was killed earlier this year. So these are very brutal, violent struggles going on in the cases that we're working on.
Folks, these are Canadian mining companies. And I was thinking earlier that we're lucky that they're doing that stuff over there, because there's no reason to think they won't do it over here when the time comes. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that goes on around the world. The corporations are just out of control. We, Canadians, have got to rise up and stop this. I mean, I'm not surprised that, has anything you've said, the media, 24 hours a day of 50 different TV stations, newspapers, radio, and nothing about this. I mean, the Canadian people are almost completely unaware of that this is going on. They just pretend it's a different world out there. We don't hear about this. We're fed, we're propagandized.
Well, I could pick up on a few points there. One is that with respect to mining companies, I highly recommend going to the website of a group out of Ottawa, Mining Watch. So the website's miningwatch.ca. This is a group of Canadians who are like a watchdog group of a sort, looking at and monitoring Canadian mining companies operating both inside Canada and around the world. So our work overlaps with them on the cases that I was referring to, because we work in one region of the world and do a wide range of work with those communities. Mining Watch is a watchdog on most or all Canadian mining companies, I suppose. And so one would go to their website to see that there's struggles going on across Canada as well. I think there's some obvious differences as to how these struggles are playing themselves out inside Canada's borders and how they're playing themselves out in countries like Honduras and Guatemala. But there's some similarities too. There's some very serious struggles in Canada, particularly when those struggles are taking place on First Nations territories. And so I would encourage any listener who wants to know about this to keep in mind that these are not just sort of horror stories that are happening in faraway places. These are very serious issues here at home. Secondly, with respect to what's happening in other countries, the stories that we're working on are common. Not every mining company around the world is operating in this way, but on the other hand, this is not a question of bad apples. There is stories from across Africa, there's stories from parts of Asia, there's stories from parts of all throughout Latin America that, and some of the stories are worse than the stories we're dealing with. Some of them aren't as bad, but what it is an industry-wide problem, and they act with effective impunity, both political and legal impunity. And an issue maybe we can get into is that there's a fundamental lack of even basic minimal laws in Canada to hold them accountable. The third point you mentioned is the role of the media. And I don't think that our media is doing its job. And perhaps I'm putting it a little bit too politely. But these issues these types of abuses have been going on for generations. My favorite author on Latin American history is Eduardo Galeano, and he wrote a book called The Open Veins of Latin America, about sort of taking a look back over 500 years of history. And the reason he put the title Open Veins of Latin America was to focus on how the European imperialists had come over looking for gold. So the mining story abuses, this is not a new story. These are new examples, but this is not a new story. So it's a very old story, and the Canadian media is not doing its job properly. In the recent couple of years, there's been actually some exceptions to that. There's actually been some decent coverage here and there, but as a whole, it's not doing its job properly. And so most Canadians are very unaware of this. And to take that issue of unawareness further, most Canadians are unaware that their pension funds are invested in all of these companies, and not just in mining companies, but resource extraction companies, in the military industry companies. So most Canadians pay by law a deduction into the Canada Pension Plan. Canada Pension Plan is heavily invested in most of these mining companies, unbeknownst to most Canadians. So there's many things that the Canadian public do not know. And we have to hold to account both our media and our politicians for not making this information available to us and debating these issues openly.
Well, I'm sure Stephen Harper doesn't know any of this, because I believe we're in fact fighting at least one and possibly two wars for democracy in the Middle East. And I'm sure if Mr. Harper knew about things that Canadian mining companies were doing throughout the world, I guess, then as a great democratic leader, he would do something to stop them.
I'm detecting just a slight bit of irony or sarcasm in your voice. I think our politicians know about these issues. extensively. And to sort of take the conversation in a slightly different direction, but it overlaps. Recently, there was a military coup in Honduras, and this was in June of 2009. And this coup took a hard situation in Honduras and made it way worse. The levels of poverty have increased in Honduras. The levels of oppression are out the roof today, as you and I sit here and talk. And arguably, Honduras is the most repressive country in the Americas today, in terms of the military-backed regime that came into power after the coup, cracking down on this amazing resistance front in Honduras, the Honduran people saying no to this illegitimate regime. So why am I bringing that up now? I'm bringing that up now because earlier this year, in April or May, Prime Minister Harper went to Honduras with a delegation of high-ranking Canadian officials and so-called business leaders and signed a free trade agreement with this fundamentally illegitimate regime in Honduras. It's headed up by Pepe Lobo. He's the so-called president. And I say so-called because he came into power after the military coup and they held these undemocratic and very violent elections. What is Canada doing with this statement? First, they're saying that we believe in the free trade agreement and this model of economic development, which is which is implementing and entrenching a profoundly unjust model of economic development. Free trade agreements support and defend the rights of international corporations and investors, such as mining companies. And at the same time, they intentionally exclude any concern for the environment, for health, for basic human rights, for local indigenous rights, etc. So that development economic model in itself is a very unjust one that favors our economic interests at the expense of the well-being of others. The second thing that Prime Minister Harper did with the signing of this agreement is he's legitimizing an illegitimate regime. He's saying it to the world, this is my democratic partner, this is who we're doing business with, he's getting things back on track in Honduras, all of which is false. So that becomes linking, that is the link back between, the knowledge of our political leaders. They know exactly what's going on in these countries and why they're doing certain things, supporting free trade agreements, supporting a coup regime in Honduras, and why are they not doing other things? So what are some of the things they're not doing? They are resisting the passing of any minimal legislation in Canada whatsoever to hold our mining companies or other resource extraction companies accountable in our courts, criminally or civilly, if and when they contribute to harms or crimes in other countries. As I said, these stories that I've mentioned in Honduras with the gang rape of people, the murder of people, the forced evictions of communities, Pacific Rim in El Salvador, the killing of 5 local poor campesinos, Goldcorp in both places with extensive environmental harm, health harms, repression. There's nowhere that Goldcorp or Hudbay Minerals or Pacific Rim can be held accountable. The mechanisms internationally are weak, and groups are trying to hold them accountable, but they're very weak. They certainly can't be held accountable in the courts of these countries because they're governed by impunity and there's a fundamental lack of rule of law, fundamental lack of democracy, and they can't be held accountable in Canadian courts. There's a few exceptions to this rule in the Canadian legal system, but both the Liberal and the Conservative parties are resisting any legislative reform at all in Canada to hold them even minimally accountable in our courts. All that to say, I think Stephen Harper knows very well what's going on.
So what's going on in Central America is horrendous. I hope people feel that way. But what can we do here in Canada? And I think what we can do is regain control of our democracy and stop these practices, because we can do it here in Canada. But, we've got to regain control of our governments, and we have to retake control of the media. We have to get a free and independent media.
I think it's multi-pronged what needs to be done in Canada and what is being done to a certain extent, but not nearly enough. There is a democracy issue here, and there is a lack of democratic accountability going on. Canadian citizens are not holding our governments accountable for much of what happens in a whole range of international affairs. For far too long, we've left international affairs to the experts. We've left international affairs to the foreign policy people. It's too complicated. We leave our economic matters to the economists and the experts. Too complicated. That's bailing out on our own democratic system. It's bailing out on our democratic responsibility. The Canadian government is promoting the expansion of Canadian resource extraction companies around the world with no checks and balances. And it's up to the Canadian people to hold our government accountable for doing that. And then the media has its role as well. The media is the one that has the job of reporting, digging out the stories, investigating the stories, and reporting the stories of power and power abuse. They do that on certain issues. And I think that, especially with respect to issues, global issues, they're not doing their job properly. We need to pressure our media to do that.
Well, I'll disagree with you.
Okay.
They are doing their job properly. The problem is the job of the Canadian media is to keep us all in the dark. Their job, they are owned by the same cabal of corporations, as you know, that are doing the damage around the world. It's all one interlinking corporate infrastructure.
Well, once you get to the side of the corporate ownership, I tend to fully agree with you. Corporate influence on our decision-making process in Ottawa. So, for example, over the past couple of years, there was an attempted legislative reform, Bill C-300, to provide some minimal amount of an accountability mechanism to rein in some of the abuses of Canadian mining companies operating around the world. It was put forth by a member of the Liberal Party, John McKay, and it wasn't even hard-hitting law, hard-biting law. It was sort of weak administrative law, but still a significant small step forward. It got rejected by Parliament. It didn't pass Parliament. And the mining industry put forward a multi-million-dollar lobby campaign to reject even this minimal law reform. So it brings it back to that point there of how corporations, both on the media side, on the privately owned media, and with respect to public policy, are dominating the policy decisions in this country for the benefit of themselves, their own corporate and investor interests. But to move along with what needs to change and come about in Canada, and it's already started, but not nearly enough, you've got that democracy gap challenge, and we have to hold our governments accountable. You've got the role of the media and the corporate dominance of the media. The investor side is a very fascinating one. As we said earlier, most Canadians are invested in these companies through their pension funds. Most Canadians are not millionaires investing with their private broker, investing gobs of money. But most Canadians have money, some money, tucked away in a pension fund. And all of these pension funds are making unchecked investments into mining industry, resource extraction companies around the world, global military industry. This is our responsibility as well. So you go down the list of how Canadians are interconnected through public policy issues, through the role that our media is playing in misinforming about these issues, right through to the investment side. And we're deeply intertwined with all these issues. And economically, Canadians are the beneficiaries. Now, obviously, some Canadians benefit a whole lot, and most Canadians aren't directly benefiting from this stuff, except perhaps indirectly through their pension funds. But either way, it is our issue, and it's up to us to hold our decision makers accountable and demand serious reform and change in laws, in global economic development policy, saying no to free trade agreements, saying yes to global promotion and defense of environmental rights, human rights, etc.
And of course, the problem is that I think most Canadians would agree with you that at least we would want to know that our Canada Pension Plan money is being invested in companies that are carrying out the most vicious acts around the world.
Though that change is slow to come about, and it's still going to take a long time, I go across the country regularly talking about these issues, exposing what's going on with Goldcorp in Honduras, Hudbay Minerals in Guatemala, Pacific Rim in El Salvador, and most in the audience are always saddened and distressed with these stories. They ask a lot of hard-hitting questions to clarify, and then they're equally distressed when they comment on the role of the media, and we're not getting the story, but when they really comment on the investment side and the fact that, unbeknownst to us, they're taking our pension funds and investing it and making a profit off of these issues. That, for me, is a real potential Achilles heel in all this, because that's when citizens, Canadians, Americans, start to feel oh my God, not only is this a distressing story, but I'm indirectly making, even however small, I'm making a benefit from this. There's a lack of accountability, lack of laws, lack of minimum standards. And then to make matters worse, it's not just mining companies, it's military, industrial companies that are producing weapons that get sold around the world or get sold to the United States for the military industrial complex. That's very stressful. And the more that Canadians find out about this, the more they're thinking, I have to do something about this. So that trickle-up critical awareness and trickle-up activism is long overdue, and it's beginning across the country.
So the question is, what can we do to make this stuff happen? One thing I'm suggesting that I've heard and that I would like is a citizens' assembly on democratic reform here in British Columbia, and really we should be having them across Canada. We've got to bring citizens in to kind of override our political masters who we can no longer trust. So a citizens' assembly, just keep that idea in mind, folks. How do people support Rights Action?
We are a very small organization, and the main thing we do, as I said at the outset, is we do the direct funding of grassroots organizations and people, and then we do this education and activism, north-south education and activism and outreach. So the issues you and I have been discussing today fall in the category of north-south education and activism, trying to get people, critically aware of these issues, and then to get more involved in demanding change and reform. But coming back to the first point, we're also a direct funder, as I said, of the very people you and I have been talking about. So after they've forcibly evicted these Mayan Kekchi communities in eastern Guatemala at the behest of Hudbay Minerals and Canadian nickel mining companies, we're directly funding the victims groups, getting these folks shelter, helping them rebuild their houses, supporting them as they demand justice in the Guatemalan courts that are going nowhere fast, supporting them as they try and seek justice through the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. And there's actually even a few creative law cases that have been filed in Toronto by the Klippensteins law firm against Hudbay Minerals to try and get some measure of justice done. So we're supporting them directly with funds. In the case of the Goldcorp struggles in both Guatemala and Honduras, there's been widespread health harm. We have raised lots of funds, and we need more funds from Canadians and American citizens and foundations. And we're directly funding people with skin and health problems, extensive hair loss. Women are having miscarriages, cows, people's cattle. These are very poor people.
These are because they live close to mines?
Live close to the mines, and the contaminants. The contaminants come through. There's been blood and urine tests done both in Honduras and Guatemala in and around Goldcorp's mine, and there's harmful levels of lead, arsenic, and mercury showing up in people's blood. And
of course, and the same thing is true right here in Canada.
Exactly.
In thousands of places, but of course the tar sands come to mind, but everywhere.
Yes. And so these are just more of the harms. And so Rights Action, we're doing the two sides of the work, is directly funding these groups to deal with the harms, to get health relief, and to fight back, to organize themselves and protest back and say, hell no, we don't want your companies here. We want you to leave, and we want you to pay reparations and compensation. So those are ongoing struggles that Rights Action's a direct funder of. And all of that's linked to the education and activism work we do across Canada and the United States on these issues. So there's directly ways that Canadians can get involved in these particular struggles by supporting Rights Action and finding out more about it on our website. But as we've been discussing, these are just stories. These are part of a broader global issue and the role that Canada plays in an unjust global economic order.
Once again, can you just mention some of the violent acts that these companies and their hirelings are committing? And then maybe you can mention the names of the companies, their full corporate names, so we know exactly who they are.
Yeah, I wrote an article recently that's been reproduced here and there called Canadian Mining Companies Making a Killing, and pun intended. So the stories that we're working on are, as I said at the outset, Rights Action works in Central America, mainly Guatemala and Honduras, a little bit in El Salvador, and sometimes into southern Mexico, which is the neighboring region to the north, so the states of Chiapas and Oaxaca. So the main stories that we have been working directly on is Goldcorp Inc. is a Vancouver-based gold mining company that operates mines from Canada all the way down to Argentina, and they're operating two huge, what are called open pit or mountaintop removal, cyanide leaching gold and silver mines in Guatemala, and Honduras. And there's been a wide range of health harms, environmental harms, and then cases of repression in both places. We're heavily involved in those struggles. In the case of nickel mining, there's been a series of Canadian companies that began with Inco back in the 60s and 70s, continue with Sky Resources in the 2000s, and now it's Hudbay Minerals. They're trying to operate a nickel mine in eastern Guatemala in indigenous Mayan Quechua territories. The mine is not operating yet. All of that struggle is related to getting rid of the indigenous people who have been living there for hundreds of years so that they can get access at the resources. So the harms there have to do with the whole-scale burning of villages, leaving very poor people in even more impoverished conditions of vulnerability, lack of access to even minimal shelter, burning their crops.
I mean, imagine.
Right.
Imagine this.
Right. And so those are the people that we're working with. This is happening right now as we speak. And on top of that, they're targeting some of the community leaders. People have been shot. People have been killed intentionally at point-blank range, machete blows. 11 women in one community were gang raped by private security guards hired by the Canadian company. These are the types of abuses with respect to Hudbay Minerals Nickel Company in Guatemala. Over in El Salvador, we've been indirectly involved in this struggle in El Salvador, but 5 community members have been killed in the region of Cabañas, which is a region right near the Honduran border. And this is where the Canadian mining company Pacific Rim wants to open a gold mine. And then in southern Mexico, a couple of years ago, there was a Canadian mining company, Blackfire Explorations, that was trying to operate a barite mine there. And a well-known community member there was, one of the leaders in the community was targeted for assassination and then killed. So these were the 4 stories that made up this article, Canadian mining companies making a killing. And those are just some of the examples of things that happen regularly at Canadian mining operated mines around the world.
So that's the story, folks. That is what's going on. That's the truth of what's going on. We don't hear the truth very often, but I think we heard some truth today, and none of us should forget it too quickly. We've been talking to Graham Russell of the group Rights Action. Thank you for watching Face to Face.